It's my pleasure to introduce Here Black and Queer, new visions for covering the Black, non-binary, and transgender communities. Today's event and conversation is led by Corey Rose, the Beyonce of audio. Corey is a first-year audio student at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism, where his work explores the intersections of public health, culture, education, and race and gender justice. Corey's commitment to journalism and building community is exemplified in many ways, including today's event. A little housekeeping and notes for our virtual attendees. For accessibility, please toggle the closed caption on YouTube. For live questions in the audience, please put them, please write them down. And with that, Corey Rose.
Thank you so much, Bashira, for that beautiful introduction. Hello and welcome to Here Black and Queer, new visions for covering the Black and transgender and non-binary communities. My name is Corey Antonia Rose, and I'm so excited to see y'all. Today, we are here to center Black, transgender, and non-binary communities in our reporting and to find out how we have been failing these communities for decades, but also how we can do better. So I'm so excited because I've brought y'all the Power Ranger of panels today. Our first guest, our first esteemed panelist is a journalist, a social curator, and a world changer, and a soon-to-be published author. At the LA Times, they created the beat of diversity in Hollywood with a focus on Black and queer film. And then they were named to the Roots Top 100 Most Influential African Americans. They've added their nuanced perspective to Essence, Time, and Teen Vogue. They're currently the editor-at-large for Xtra Magazine, one of my favorite mentors, and a co-host of 2 podcasts, What a Day and Fanti. Please welcome Tre'Vell Anderson.
Thank you, Corey.
Thank you. Our next panelist is a writer, dancer, and archivist from Houston, Texas. Her work captures the realities and history of Black trans women in and outside of the ballroom community. If you've ever checked out Femme Queen Fridays on Insta, she's the genius behind it. Welcome, Noelle Deleon.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me.
Hey, girl.
Hello.
Completing our panel is a longtime activist for the transgender community. She cut her teeth in activism in 1999, winning a First Amendment case against an Indiana high school. Then she didn't stop there. She was the first openly transgender woman to attend Jackson State University. And she's currently the executive director of Black Trans Women, Inc., an executive organization and advocacy group focused on building strong and effective Black trans leadership. She's also the host of a popular YouTube channel and one of my favorite podcasts, Marsha's Plate, where she explores politics and culture from a Black trans perspective. You've seen her on CNN, ABC, The Root, and so many others. Please welcome icon Diamond Stylz.
Hi, thank you for having me, Corey. Hey, Corey.
Hey. I'm so happy to have y'all all in the room. How are we feeling? What's the tea?
I'm feeling good. I'm feeling really good today. How are y'all?
Feel good as well.
Well, I feel less good, but I'm here, and that's what that.
That's real. This is an honest space, and so we were ready to have a real honest conversation. So I want to jump right in with Tre'Vell and Diamond. I'm asking y'all to set us up. What has the history of coverage of these communities looked like? And how have journalists historically failed us in the past?
You want me to take it?
Start. Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So in the past, a lot of the coverage, like when we get back to like the 50s and the 60s, we were kind of covered as like these freaks of nature. Even the language that you hear people talking about us is in regards to that. Like, oh, these are freaks, these are anomalies. There's no any kind of medical or supportive conversation around it. It's just these are freaks of nature. And there was this hint of they're pedophiles. Because they lumped us in together with homosexuals, and that was also the same type of demonization that homosexuals was going through at the time. As we get further into 1900s, it started to be more the novelty, the sensation. So we start to get shows and movies that shocked us. They exposed our body parts. And, when we think about The Crying Game, they exposed us. Is this a man or a woman? When we think about like the Jerry Springers and the Maury's and the stuff like that, it was more about the sensation and just the shock of it so they can get ratings. Then as we get a little further, early 2000s, we start to get a little bit more dignity, still sensationalized, but there's a little bit more dignity when we start getting on the Oprah show, usually white. Usually they were featuring some white trans person who transitioned when they were older, who had a wife and kids, a pension. And they started to talk about it a little bit more with a little bit more humanity, but still, they were a star football player, or they were a military guy, and now they're a blonde bombshell. Reminiscent of when Kristen Jorgensen transitioned, even though there were some Black trans women who had gotten sex change around that time as well. But because she was a white one, everybody was going crazy in 1952. So it started to be a little bit more dignity. And then as you go on, we go a little bit further and more humanity starts to be involved in it. Now, when we start to get to the, like the Candace Canes, and we start to see depictions of us on Botched and on primetime TV, when we get into these eras, they start telling stories, but usually it was depicted like sex workers, just different things, that somebody has gotten murdered, somebody has gotten attacked. There was some kind of deception going along with this whole, these are just freaks, sexual deviants, nothing real. There's nobody in a quote unquote respectable positions. It's all about the negative. And and then we start to shift in this last decade where we see and get control of our narrative, and we see more stories being told about us, more positive, more nuanced stories about us. And it's a tipping point, as the cover of Times with Laverne Cox says. It was a tipping point where we are a turning point, where we are being a little bit more respected, and along with the help of amazing journalists like Monica Roberts, we started to see us talked about across mediums with respect, dignity, humanity, respecting who we are, and not just seen as sexual deviants.
Got you. Tre'Vell, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I would just add, by even going a little further back, I know we're going to get to Monica in a moment, but it was through Monica's blog Transgrio that I discovered a lot of coverage of Black trans folks, in particular in Black publications back in the day, in your Ebony's, in your Jets. Now, to Diamond's point, they was misgendering folks through and through, right? Like, it was trash. But, our experiences were documented in a sort of way. And I feel like I like to go back as far as a Lucy Hicks Anderson or a Jim McHarris or whatever, because oftentimes, because of the ways that our communities have been erased in media, whether you're talking from the entertainment Hollywood aspect or you're talking from the news journalism aspect, so much about what we know about our history, a lot of times, for a lot of people, starts with Laverne on that Time cover, right? They believe and feel like trans people just came out of nowhere with Laverne, right? And there is a long storied history of gender expressive, gender expansive people, and Black people specifically. And so yeah, I piggyback off of Diamond in saying that, like, so much of the coverage has only really began to change in the last decade or so, right? And in large part due to the attention that was around Laverne and Orange is the New Black, Netflix in those early years. I feel like the visibility that she provided, along with other folks, right? Carmen Carrera's in that moment, in terms of her experience. Chaz Bono it was also like right before, I think 2008 maybe.
Yep.
Jayla Sims, when she won with Diddy.
And so there's just so many folks who had been like existing and doing work, but I feel like that 2014 moment is when we began to see a shift. And I think us as a community, right, largely led by Monica, right, was able to like harness our voices and our powers and begin to hold news media accountable for the misgendering, for the problematic coverage.
Thank you. Noelle, I want to shift to you and ask, when you were transitioning, how did you see the coverage of the trans community and how did that inform how you saw yourself?
Honestly, well, I've been in a queer space since I was a child, right? So I already knew of trans people, already knew that was possible, but I didn't know it was possible for me. So when I stepped into my identity in 2019, I was already aware of like the coverage and the existence of trans people during that time. And honestly, it changed everything for me. You know, the work that I do is because of the importance of the history of Black trans people and the importance of why we are here and the stories we tell.
Thank you. I want to talk about Monica Roberts, and I feel like I could do a great introduction, but why bother when someone who actually knew her is with us? So Diamond, tell us, who was Monica? What did she do? And how did she shake the table?
Oh gosh. So yes, Monica was a very close friend. She lives 4 blocks from me. I would go to the grocery store for her, go to Kroger's. Girl, you want me to pick you up something? So you don't have to come out here, particularly around COVID. And I can bring you some food or whatever. So, you know, I really miss her. And, you know, she was definitely a big loss to the community. So the first time that I met Monica, she was, I actually didn't meet her in person until 2010. But I engaged with her work because her work featured me. So what happened was Monica ended up moving to Louisville, and she got a column in this paper in Louisville. And in that paper, my aunt called and told me when I sued my high school in 1999 and won, my aunt called and told me and said, hey, they put you in a newspaper down here. And I'm like, why are they putting me in a news? Because I was in Indianapolis at the time. I was like, but why? This is kind of like local news. Why would they put me in a newspaper there? And so in that paper, Monica featured my story. And I heard about Monica through that. That was the very first time some random reporter, didn't even know she was trans at the time. I just thought it was some random reporter, just talked about my story. So fast forward to 2008. This is the first time that I started uploading videos to YouTube. And at the time, I was the only person talking about trans stuff in the YouTube world. And anytime I would try to Google trans stuff, what would come up is trans griot. Monica had meticulously went through the newly digitized Ebony archives. So she went through every single one, specifically looking for trans stories, trans individuals, film stars, authors, whoever was being reported on in the Ebony that, you know, usually, you know, at that time, everything wasn't digital yet, but Ebony put their stuff in digital, and she literally went through it all. And she started her blog, Trans Griot, and you couldn't find trans stuff without trans griot popping up. And every time we would see stories covering our death, covering us being murdered, you would see Monica in the comments writing letters, calling them out on her blog about not using their right name, even though the AP standard was you use the right name, you use the right pronouns and gender for us. She was like, you're not even following the standard of your field, of leading people in your field. So she would call them out so much, and her blog grew so much that it started to shift how everybody, not just in her local hometown in Houston, but how everybody around the country covered and talked about trans people without it being focused on gender, without it being focused on the sensationalism of, oh, a man in a dress got murdered or something silly like that. It was really with respect and dignity, and that what we seeing that shift where we are now is because of Monica Roberts.
Got you. Tre'Vell, you led the effort to get Monica Roberts inducted into the Hall of Fame for the National Association of Black Journalists and the National Association of LGBT Journalists as well. Tell us, what can we as journalists learn from her story? And what was your experience with her like, seeing that coverage?
Yeah, I mean, even before I, blossomed into this fabulous individual, I was familiar with Transgrio as a space because Monica was the only one really doing it, right? And to reiterate Diamond's point, I often say that when our journalism, news media industry finally gets to a place where we are documenting and reporting on the lives of trans folks in the ways that we should, with the dignity that we should, you will be able to directly trace that to Monica Roberts, period. Right? And I think for those of us who are doing the work now, I think that if you ever met Monica, I first met Monica at the NABJ convention in 2016. We were in DC. It was a joint convention with NAHJ. And we met at the LGBTQ task force reception that year. And Monica, if you didn't know Monica, she stand out in the crowd. She tall. She had a very unique laugh, right? She had a very unique laugh. And so she just claimed a lot of space. And for me, as somebody who was just coming into themselves at that time, to see this Black trans woman taking up so much space in the conservative halls of NABJ was like super instructive and has been super instructive. And so I say, in terms of what we can learn from the work that she did, is that, it sounds kind of cliche, but one person really can change shit, because Monica did it. Right. And, we were able to, I was able to, like you said, to get her posthumously inducted into NABJ's Hall of Fame. But, we were giving her flowers while she was with us. I do feel like she felt loved, and she recognized her impact, because any Black trans journalist that is working and doing this work right now, we all uplift Monica as the pioneer, right? We would not be able to do what we do if it was not for her. And she cared so much about many of us, right? Developing those particular relationships. And so I would just say that, one person really can change things. And that's particularly important for like this audience, because you gonna come up against some foolishness in this industry, honey, right? And like you have to allow your convictions, right, to direct you in the way that feels most authentic to you. And Monica's a great example of that.
Absolutely. I want to make it clear, like, it wasn't like Monica was just saying these things and there wasn't pushback, or like people didn't also ignore her feedback. Like, it was tough, and she was giving real tea, and it's the same tea that, when people spill it today, they get met with pushback. And so I just want to recognize, like, what she did was truly revolutionary. And it was her pushing against the same institution that we are professing to be a moral authority for this country. So, yeah. I want to talk about how Monica has influenced all of your work. And so I want to start with Tre'Vell, with a clip from one of the podcasts that you host, What a Day. This is Tre'Vell talking about the Netflix walkout in response to anti-trans commentary from Dave Chappelle.
There was another trans employee who was suspended while the company investigated claims that the employee tried to attend a meeting they weren't invited to. That suspension has since been lifted. And then secondly, I want to explicitly state why Ted Sarandos' statement about comedy not inciting violence is dense, in my opinion, and ahistorical. There is a documented history about the ways language can and does perpetuate various attitudes that manifest as violence, as oppression. There's even a documentary called Disclosure on Netflix that specifically details how comedy at the expense of trans people perpetuates and leads to the epidemic of violence against trans people we're currently experiencing. FYI, for those who don't know, 2021 is on track to be the deadliest year on record in the U.S. and Puerto Rico for trans and gender nonconforming people, having already seen at least 41 folks fatally shot or killed by other violent means, according to the Human Rights Campaign.
Yeah, it is awful. And
Thank you so much for that. Tre'Vell, why did you feel like it was important for you to add that information, and how does it change the frame of context around what you're trying to tell, around the story you're trying to tell?
Yeah. So What a Day, for those who don't know, is a daily news podcast from Crooked Media. And we do these 20 to 30 minute episodes every day to try to give you kind of a recap of the day's news. And the whole Dave Chappelle brouhaha was going down. And for me, I think I just felt as if, a lot of times when folks are covering issues as it relates to trans people, we've seen this happen with Black people and other, minorities before, but there's always this need to do like the both sides thing, right? I hope they're not still teaching y'all about objectivity and bullshit in school, okay? Because it's a scam, right? It's a lie. There's no such thing as objectivity. Objectivity is just subjectivity determined by those who are already in power, right? And so it leaves those of us who are Black, queer, trans, et cetera, right, always being subjective, right, in terms of the types of stories that we're interested in. And so I think it's important always to do kind of a level setting when it comes to things that like actually manifest in terms of violence that folks are experiencing. And what we saw in so much of the discourse around that moment and so much of the coverage was, again, this like debating the validity of our experiences as trans people, right? Like we're telling you that these types of things lead to the violence that our siblings are experiencing. And you just like, nah, y'all too sensitive. Like, come on now, right? And so adding that context on that podcast for me was important so that we can actually make the connection. Because sometimes people don't see the connection as readily as we see it. And I think as journalists, we should be adding that necessary context to ensure that what becomes the historical record is an accurate, well-rounded representation of like what our lived experiences are today.
I also want to make it clear, you read books and you do research. You were not, just born or created out the womb knowing these decades and decades of context around these situations. Correct?
We all put in the work though, right? Like, I feel like, there is, and the work looks different, right? You have the formal kind of educational, institutional work, like going to school, all that extra stuff, right? But like, there is a work that is us as Black trans folks, as non-binary folks, like creating ourselves out of our imaginations, right? Like that's some real work, and that alone, right, in my eyes, makes us an expert on our experiences, right? But so often we don't see that translated in terms of the news stories that we see being told about us, right? Because they always want to interview a doctor. They always want to interview somebody who ain't trans, right? To talk about our experiences as trans people. And it's because they have this kind of ivory tower understanding of what being an expert is, right? And that often leaves those folks who look like us out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody who's on a campus with a literal ivory tower, I definitely understand where you're coming from. Our next segment is from Diamond's podcast, Marsha's Plate, in which she does a segment called Trans 101, which I highly recommend. And this is her talking about the anti-trans legislation coming out of Texas.
Practice healthcare for transgender kids. They are calling it child abuse, and they are calling for family protective services, which, generally around the country is called CPS, like child protective services. They are calling for them to enforce this opinion, to actually investigate into parents who are actually supporting their children the way all major credible medical associations say to support their trans youth. Now, I'm not the smartest person in the world, but it makes sense to me that if all the doctors are saying this is how you support your trans child, then why are the dumbass governor and attorney general trying to push child protective services to investigate parents who have trans children?
Now, Diamond, I can hear how personal this is to you in your voice, and Tre'Vell, I kind of heard it in yours as well. This is something that many journalists lean away from. They try to go for the view from nowhere in the name of objectivity. But I want to know from you, Diamond, how does, as someone who brings their personal experience and their lived experience to their work, how does this manifest and make you a better, or a more well-positioned person to cover this?
First and foremost, I think it lends itself to my authenticity. It lets you know this is my experience. I transitioned in '95. I transitioned coming from a home that was affected by the crack epidemic, coming from a home that was affected by the 3 strikes rule in the crime bill that we kind of ring Biden about. These are my lived experiences, and I come from a generation of trans women prior to the internet. I come from all these things inform who I am and how I see the world. And so when I come to the mic, I'm coming with my regular voice. I'm not trying to code switch. I want you to know you are to listen and talking to a Black girl. I want you to know that I'm not talking from somewhere that I'm not touching. I want you to, I'm literally in this thing. I want you to know that I'm the one who gets the calls when trans women body has to be identified and they don't know who they are because they can't identify them through, whatever they have. Because they know they trans, I'm the one in my city that they have to call so I can go to the morgue to see if I know this girl. This is my lived experiences. This is my lived experience. I'm the one who has to house these transgender youth on my couch when their parents are kicking them out, when they don't have supportive parents. So I'm the one who has to make room. I literally have only couches that turn into beds because of this reason. So this is the life that I live. So I want you to know when I'm on the mic and I'm telling you these stories is because I know what this type of rhetoric and this type of bullshit leads to. So that's why it's important to me to show up and share my experience, because if you don't know that context, like Tre'Vell said, you may be so ignorant and just out of the loop that you don't understand what we are talking about when these jokes are not just jokes, that you don't understand what we are talking about when we say that just like you felt when you left HBO because you thought the white people was laughing at you and not with you, just that same thing, that's exactly how we felt. And this is affecting us. When you call us alphabet people, when I'm on the train to go to my underpaid job, it's people on the bus that won't let me sit next to them and want to fight me because I'm sitting next to them on the bus or on the train because you have called me the alphabet people. So now they're spewing that to me. This is how it directly affects my life. This is how it directly, when I go into the doctor's office and they don't understand transes and I got to teach them about something, the doctors who got the medical degrees and all that kind of stuff. I got to teach them about pronouns. This is my lived experience. 101 shit. This is my lived experience. And so when I'm sharing stories, yes, I want to give you the facts. I don't want it to just be anecdotal. There's going to be I'm going to go and give you the research that may be that may support my lived experience, or it could be against. I'll be clear and I'll say that. Look, this is what the data says. And then I say this is what my lived experiences is. And so I think that's important. I think both sides, because it gives you both sides of anecdotal and data. I think it's important to do that because that just gives people more robust perspective of what you're talking about. And that's why it's personal to me.
You touched on your own activism within your community, and I want to know, as somebody who's been at the front line of these protests, representing families and children who would otherwise face persecution under state-sanctioned persecution under state Texas law, what were your takeaways, and what messages can you relay to these journalists about the way we cover Texas, and specifically the anti-trans legislation happening there now?
Recently, I was featured at South by Southwest this past weekend, and we did a demonstration at the governor's mansion. And so tons of supportive families, trans people. It was amazing. But we had people coming with the trolls, coming with their bullhorns. And they were saying things that you can see. They didn't think of this. They didn't think of this on themselves. They literally are regurgitating what some right-wing journalist has put forth as the idea. He literally was asking us, why are y'all trying to get 1-year-olds to get sex changes? Baby, 1-year-olds are not getting sex changes. Who told you that? Somebody wrote that on Breitbart. Somebody wrote that. Where did you get this information? You can't even get a sex change until you're 18 in this country. So what you're talking about is not even in the context of what we are talking about. When we talk about trans care and trans youth care, we're talking about just the social transition. Are we letting them grow their hair out? Are we letting them wear what they want to wear? Are we talking to them with their affirmed pronouns in their name? It's the social transition. It's not the medical transition that is the focus when we talk about kids. That is not the focus. So when you're talking about a 5-year-old kid shouldn't be able to get a sex change, you don't know what you're talking about. And so you are believing what these right-wing journalists has put out there. And so we are the front lines as journalists in setting the narrative and setting the tone. And the opposite end knows how important it is to set that tone, because these crazy people are going to pick it up and run with it. And so that's what we see all the time when we go to demonstrations. The people don't even know what they're talking about, and we just make them look stupid. Because that's just not the truth. And somebody gave you that information, and usually it's some type of journalist who doesn't have the integrity. So you want to make sure that you as a journalist has the integrity to give the information and give the facts.
If I could just add really quickly, like, read the laws, y'all. Like, everybody is just like regurgitating things that they heard somebody else say. But like, if you're a journalist, like, read the laws, y'all, like, or go read the police reports for, these different cases, the idea of like verifying information is something that seems to be lost even among other journalists. And so like, I would just encourage folks to, to remember some of those tenets of journalism that you're allegedly being, taught or whatever, of like fact verification, right? Of like, you go down to the courthouse, you find the lady in the purple dress, because the lady in the purple dress know all the bones are buried, right? And she give you all of the stuff that you need. Like, those types of things, even when you are doing stories about whether you are a member of the community or if it's another, somehow marginalized community, those types of foundations help ensure that you aren't, unintentionally or intentionally perpetuating and passing off wrong information, right? Because even a lot of the folks just who might be covering these types of issues haven't done the work necessary to really cover these things in the ways that they should, right? And so it ends up being this whole cycle of foolishness, because don't nobody want to go read the darn law, or don't nobody want to go read it themselves and like see these kind of things that just get like the idea that that trans youth are, having sexual reassignment surgery or whatnot, which is, absurd. But like, a lot of people just don't know that.
Absolutely. I mean, the basis of racism, sexism, and homophobia and transphobia and reporting is inaccuracy. And that's the one thing that they do teach you, is that not to be inaccurate. Hey, Noelle, we're about to play a clip from your archive in which someone who is very important to you is doing what they do. So we're going to watch, and then we're going to come right back to you. Who is this person? What are they to you? And why did you feel it was important to include this in your archive? You're muted, love.
Sorry.
You good.
Sorry, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. That is my mother icon, Christina Richards. I felt it was important to include that video in my archives because I feel like the history of Black trans women inside of Ballroom is essential. I feel like, well, I'm not going to say I feel like Ballroom is a space where Black trans women could go to feel highlighted, to feel validated in a world that is teaching us not to love ourselves, is teaching us not to be proud of who we are, is forcing us to hide our truth, right? Ballroom has been a space to where we could go to feel loved, to feel validated, to display our talents. And the work that I do is centered around that. So that is why I post clips. That is why I travel to talk about the importance of Vogue and Femme Queen performance and what Ballroom has done for our Black trans women, because it's history, you know?
Absolutely. I mean, there's something to be said about capturing footage of a community outside of the white gaze and outside the white gaze.
Right. Right.
As far as our work as journalists of like, we're supposed to be going out and showing these communities in their wholeness and in their completion. And that's what I think is so beautiful about your archive. And so I'm wondering, do you consider your archival work to be a work of journalism? And what can journalists learn from your work, your archives?
I do. It was not until I started, I was already archiving like music and the history of music and other forms of history and before 2019, before I started my transition. So archiving Ballroom and the history of Vogue has been a way for me validating my own reality and validating myself as well. I look at it as a form of journalism. I didn't look at myself as a writer until last year. I just loved talking about it, and I've always loved talking about things. But it wasn't until a good friend of mine, Shamari Reed, he told me, "You're a writer. Like what you're doing is you're writing about history." And I now I feel this is a form of journalism. And I think what journalists can learn from what I'm doing, and I'm still learning as well at being a writer in this space and having all of this, having a look on me now as a writer. I feel as though other journalists can learn that this was another space of Black excellence. This was another space of beauty. I'm sorry. Honestly, it's a lot. Like it's a lot. Being considered a writer, being considered a journalist, it's something that I don't take lightly. It's something that I feel as though we need in this world. People need to see the history of Black trans people. People need to see the history of it all. So.
Absolutely. And so I want to move to new visions. You know, it's in the title. So where do each of you see the coverage of Black and transgender and non-binary communities going in the future? And how can we as journalists do our job and our due diligence to decolonize the way we've been reporting and the way we've been thinking about approaching this subject? And I guess we can start with Tre'Vell and then go around.
Okay, I'm gonna get to your question, but first I was thinking and ruminating on the question that you asked Noelle about like archiving being like a form of journalism. And a thought that I had was that, like, you know, particularly with what Noelle is doing with Ballroom, you know, if our news media had been better, right, back in the day when many of these femme queens, right, were turning it out in the ballrooms, like they would have been your cover models. They would have been, you know, your stars, right? They would have been featured in these publications. And so, but the news media wasn't covering the community like that, right? Ballroom as a space wasn't, you know, everybody interested in ballroom today, right? But, you know, back then, right, it was still this like underground, you know, space that like, while the community itself loved on itself and put itself up to a certain stature for so long, right? It was such a safe space to where much of what they were doing wasn't shared with the outside world. And so I love the idea of looking at archiving and archival work as a form of journalism, because what from what I see, what Noelle is doing is like correcting the record, right? Like she is finding these histories, these stories, these narratives, and like giving them their due in the way that they should have been. So I just wanted to say that.
Right.
Now to your question, Corey. New visions. I mean, here's the thing. For me, I feel like, you know, there are more trans identified folks working as journalists today than there were 5 years ago. I think that's a great start. But those trans journalists ain't getting hired. Right? The news outlet paid well, right? Period. Right. And so when I think about new visions for like what this looks like for us, I first and foremost think about, you know, trans folks who are interested in being journalists, archivers, et cetera, right? Having the opportunity, the access, the ability to like make their living doing what they love, right? And so many of us have to, you know, cobble together a couple different things to be able to do what we love. And so I think about that. I also think about how, you know, there's some trans folks, some trans journalists who don't want to do the trans beat, right? And we should have a space where they are able to do hard news if they want to do hard news. They should be able to do, you know, the entertainment celebrity red carpet thing if that's what they want to do. Right? They shouldn't always, we shouldn't be always forced to only do the trans, the queer thing. And the last thing I'll say is also, I'm just thinking about, you know, the young folks in the room and what I hope they are getting from this discourse. And it's that like you are, if you're trying to be a journalist, if you're trying to come into this industry, you're going to be part of, you know, when folks look back on this time period, right? What you write is what they will look at to determine what life was like for folks today, right? And if that is not enough reason for you to do the self-education that you need to do to be able to cover Black and brown, queer and trans stories with the honor that our stories deserve to be covered, then maybe you should reconsider careers, in my opinion. Because, you know, I just need folks to like realize what we're doing as journalists and the impact that type of record has for generations to come. Because like, what could our lives have been like as Black trans folks, right? If there was better coverage, right, of our communities before Laverne Cox, right? Like, what could I have been, right, as a child growing up in the 90s, having access to meaningful, nuanced images and reflections of trans folks in media writ large, right? Like, you know, she's a bad bitch. She turned out fine. Don't get me wrong, right? But I could have been better, right? I could have did it earlier, right? I could have tapped into my essence a lot earlier, right? And so I just want folks to like consider and think about, you know, what the impact of your work could be. And then in understanding that, hopefully you rise to the occasion that our stories as Black trans folks in particular deserve.
So much. Diamond?
I think that we need to go deeper. Like anytime you are creating something or covering something, we need to go deeper to avoid what Tre'Vell and Noelle was saying about how we're like correcting wrong coverage. And all marginalized people can relate to that. We are always, you know, when we think about the mainstream of the civil rights movement, we are now talking about Bayard Rustin. We are now talking about Claudette Colvin and even people before her, Rosa Parks. And we are now talking about the brilliance that was Polly Murray. Do you see what I'm saying? We are now and how there, and I'm intentionally calling them there because how their work led to the rights of Black people, their framing of the work, their intersections led to the rights that we have now as Black people and the rights that we have now as women folk. So we are now correcting those things. If you go deeper from the start, if you go deeper from the start and just don't be on the surface level, really be really intentional about how deep you go into covering this thing. We can start at excellence instead of trying to create excellence later on. We can start at Black excellence right now. I think about a perfect example is, let's talk about T.S. Madison. So when we think about T.S. Madison and her rise to fame, T.S. Madison, even on her own, has been, she got a show now with Fox Soul, her own show with WeTV. On her own, she has always been trying to buck up against her past when it comes to her being an ex-porn star, award-winning porn star, a sex worker, and those things, because they wouldn't let her transfer into, I'm using quotes, legitimate work because sex work is work. She's trying to separate herself from her past, but I was there. And so I'm going to tell you what because we were not deeper and because we didn't go deeper in her story, you didn't understand that in her industry as a porn star, because I was there, in her industry, she broke barriers because she was a big, Black, tatted, hood, Black girl from Miami. Everybody else was this clean cut. I want to be white. I want to get into the industry. I want to be this image that is more white. I want to have the long hair. I want to look mixed. I want to claim that I'm Black and Brazilian. I want to claim that I'm Black and Asian. I want to claim that I'm Black and something else because I want to separate myself from Blackness. She was the girl said, I'm a Black hood bitch and I'm going to give you this sex kitten. I'm going to give you this big girl body. I'm not going to try to be skinny. I'm going to represent the Black girl that I know is out here, because I've been out here and I know men love us because we've been making money in this game. And so she was on the cutting edge for me as a Black trans woman. She was on the cutting edge of this culture that we see now. This is back in 2001, 2002, 2003. This culture of body acceptance, body positivity. T.S. Madison was on the cusp of that, creating that image in the sex industry. And because of respectability politics, we don't want to talk about that. And we're forcing her to not talk about that history in herself. But this is an important part of her history because she gave us power to say we can make this money, to say we can love our bodies however it is. And this is a part of her legacy too, not just 22 inches in Vine videos. And when y'all saw her, she had already been making marks. She had already been living in the chateau. She was already that girl to us. And so we got to make sure that when we go deeper, that we are looking into that history and looking into the impact that we were making. Because even like I said, with her, she couldn't, because she was trying to take it to another level, she couldn't shine light on that past about herself because people were dogging her. Even trans community, even trans members like Carmen Carrera was talking about she wasn't the right representation for trans people, but she actually was, bitch. period. She actually been that, and that's what she is. And so, but if we go deeper and we get past respectability politics, we get past all these rules around society, we actually can get to the real and full whole person of T.S. Madison. And that, to me, that's a perfect example, because if we go deeper, we'll be able to see her as a full person, not just what we want her to be, not just see the benefit of her whole life experience. And I think we should do that. Always go deeper.
Thank you so much. Noelle? You're muted, love. It's okay.
All right, can you hear me? I'm sorry. I like my background to overcloud what everyone was saying. Diamond, I love that you said intention, because that's something I try to stress in the work that I do and what I talk about. If we're not being intentional and purposeful about what we're talking about and the work that we do, there would be no growth. I feel as though for journalists to in a queer space to get better and to evolve, it's so important to be intentional. It's so important to make sure what we're talking about is accurate. It's so important to make sure the work that we're doing is being received in the best way possible, is translating in the best way possible. If we are not being intentional about how we speak about certain things, about how we speak about history, about how we speak about the realities of things, no one will understand. So.
You. We're about to move into our live question portion. And we already have one from YouTube. Kathleen Maloma writes, so often as Black, trans / non-binary people, we have to explain our existence to straight, cis, white folks, mostly for our own safety. How do you turn off this white cis gaze in your mind, as it can be exhausting? And ultimately, how do you turn off your own gaze?
So for me, you played a clip from Trans 101 on my show. So I would always, because I've been in this thing for I came out in 95. Some things are quite obvious to me because I've been in it for so long, but some people could be coming into this and learning about trans people today. If they've been under a rock, I don't know, but sometimes they are. And so the rock of religion, the rock of politics, the rock of so many, they could be under a damn rock somewhere. And so sometimes they're coming to your work from a place of ignorance. And for me, I'm not your 101 girl, but I have to have something for the 101 people. So I literally created Trans 101 so when I'm getting these emails with these 101 questions, I actually can spend 5-10 minutes, a segment on talking, explaining the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation. Do I want to spend a whole hour and a half on that? No, but I can give you 5 minutes, girl. That's okay. I can give you 5 minutes. And because this is in podcast form, I'm not spending that time in person when I'm at a protest or when I'm doing something I think is more impactful and meaningful. I'm doing it on an hour podcast that's edited, that's passive. You can listen and go back to it and re-listen to it. It's not really taking up my immediate time. I don't like to answer one-on-one questions in person because I think I'm going to look at you like, what? Do you not read books? Where have you been? And so, but I can use this because I'm intentionally making this an educational space. I can use this little 5 minutes to actually not be so arrogant and think, in my trans ivory tower, and that everybody knows all of this. I can come down and say, hey, this is the basics. And then the rest of the show, I'm going to be more deep. But that 5 minutes of the Trans 101 segment is to teach and to educate, because that is ultimately what I want to do, regardless of where you are in your space of dealing with the trans community, whether you're an ally, where you've been in it. I want to teach you something.
Absolutely.
For me,
girl.
Sorry. For me, honestly, I was at a point was at a point to where I was not interested in explaining the reality, the struggle, the lived experience of being trans, right? But I realized that it's important to, you can explain, people can come and ask you about, what you experience day to day, your life, your history, and they've already made up their minds about you and who you are, but they still come and ask you. So I think that's when it becomes a problem. People, inquiring minds who are asking, but their minds are already made up. They already know how they're going to treat you and how they're still going to view you at the end of the day. But it is important for people who truly do not understand or truly want to know and how to better show up, that it's okay to explain these things and that it's okay to give them that space to understand. So I think the goal is to be intentional with the right people and not people who have already made up their minds about you. That's what it is for me as of now.
I love that. I'll just add that I think that there is, I think in an ideal world, we'll create a space where the folks who are interested in engaging folks on that trans one-on-one tip can do that. And the folks that aren't interested in doing that type of work, they can do something else over here. Now, as for me and me, I will do trans one-on-one, but you got to pay me. Like this. And where I am in my career today, baby, there's a lot of stuff out there, a lot of folks you can follow on social media who do that work, right? Whose entire brand is about teaching you how to be less ignorant, right? As it relates to trans folks, right? And so I think I want to get at the question asker's point about like gazes in particular. And I think that I think you have to find resolve within yourself with whatever your gaze may be, and be cognizant of the moments where your gaze is a reflection or manifestation of anti-Blackness or white supremacy or transphobia or fat phobia or ableism, right? And all of that. And I say all of this as somebody who fucks up often, okay, baby, listen, I get dragged often, right? But like, that's also part of being human, right? And I think particularly folks who might be in this audience who might be at less hip with the trans stuff, right? Like you got to get comfortable making a mistake, honey, right? Because that's the only way you gonna grow. And so back to the gazes, and I'll shut up. I think for me, it is about not necessarily trying to turn something on and turn something off, but like recognizing the moments where anti-Blackness, internalized transphobia, all of these isms and obias pop up, and then doing some work to undo that, right? To interrogate why I just said this really fat phobic thing, right? Do the work on it, and then proceed to try to not be trashed like that, going forward, right? And so, yeah, I don't know if I answered their question, but like I wanted to say that.
Yeah.
I think it's also I think it's important to be true to yourself too, and don't just always be in the mind of I'm combating against this white narrative. I'm combating against this misogynistic narrative. I'm combating. If in your creation, in your content, do what you feel passionate about, what you love, everything that centers your joy. I think. For me, it's all about when I want to interview somebody, it's just not about who's the most popular trans person. I just recently had a cishet Black man on my show because I loved his thought process when it comes to dismantling toxic masculinity, because I wanted to talk to him. And everybody was like, why are you bringing this cishet dude online? And then once they listen, they're like, oh, wow. I wanted that. It wasn't because I wanted to, be controversial or, I wanted to have that conversation so I can learn. And so make sure that you are centering what you want to flick, as Toni Morrison say, flick that white man off your shoulder. And, don't worry about it. Just do she said she wanted to write how she would write if none of these people was watching. And so that's what you got to do. Just make sure that what would you present? What brings you joy to talk about?
We can't hear you, Corey.
You know, we're working on it. It's okay.
Oh, okay.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, thank you, Corey, for bringing this amazing panel. This is the best way to start our spring break, I think. I'm wondering, when you're reporting on trans, non-binary, and the queer community, and you want to use data, what are your strategies for sifting through data that's just vastly inaccurate a majority of the time? And a lot of the people who are the quote unquote truth makers, I'm talking police, doctors, are transphobic and everything. And how do you sift through that and still use it to your ability to make an accurate story?
Well, I'll first repeat something that I think Diamond said that I really liked was, you know, she mentioned how she'll use the like statistical type of stuff that, because a lot of folks like that type of data, understanding of our lived experiences, but she will also inject what her lived experience is, right? In terms of like adding some extra context, some livedness to the data. But I will also just note that like a lot of the data that we're about trans people specifically, and Black trans people even more specifically, we're just beginning to get, right? Like they're just beginning to you know, ask about, you know, trans identity, right? In these census type, you know, entities that lead to the data that folks are able to cite. And so I think a lot of it is about, you know, realizing that like sometimes you might have to create the data. Like you might have to tease through, right? You might have to look at the police report, right, to see that they actually misgendered this person, right? And, you know, made a small note in the police report that the person was like femme presenting or wearing a dress or something like that, to be able to tell that actually that's a trans woman, right? And these systems that we have established as truth makers, truth tellers, as you say, Corey, such as police, such as medical providers, don't always tell the full story. And so you might be making a lot of these databases. You might have to do a little extra work, go an extra step to tease through the specifics, especially as language changes, right? And the words that we use to refer to ourselves today aren't the words that were used to refer to us, or that we as trans people refer to ourselves back in the day, right? One of those historical moments that Diamond was speaking to is that, you know, if you go back and look at a lot of the past coverage of trans people, they're calling them gay, right? They're calling trans women gay men, right? And that's because of what the language ecosystem was at the time. And so I think you just have to have a more critical eye when you're looking at data, particularly as it relates to trans people, because of some of those interventions, right, that we have created as a community language-wise that allow us to have a label on something today, but may not have allowed our ancestors to have that same label back in the day. I hope that answers your question. It's okay if it didn't though, but that's what it was in my head. Okay.
Yeah, done. She's nodding. So that's affirmative.
And also, let me quote Kim Kardashian: "Folks don't want to do the work." Just kidding. But yeah, it's in this context, that is true. Some people, you're gonna have to go out here and do the work. So literally what Tre'Vell just said, I literally had to go through case by case, state by state, to create my own data for my organization. Literally going through data, going through cases, going through, police reports, literally to find out what state has had the most transgender women murders. Like, what is that? And unfortunately, I found out that it was my state of Texas. But it wasn't just southern states. You had Ohio, you had New York, you had some places in California that were high as well. And also what I found out in my data when I go through the case, when usually we know trans women dominate the murders, but like take trans women out of it and just focus on trans men. Did you know that 40% of trans men's death were by police on medical calls, on just like mental health checkup calls? So they also are being 40% of all the cases since 2015. And so I had to literally go through case, literally. It was a lot of work. Took me about 2 weeks, but I had the data. I was able to share it. I was able to give you reference to every single case. I was able to set the foundation for other people to use this kind of work. And so be that diligent in doing the work so that the data is out there, and you make sure you are honest about sharing the true findings. I knew as a trans woman that it wasn't some crazy random person that was killing us. I knew based on my lived experiences that it was our intimate partners that was killing us. It was not some random person. Now, was the data saying that a long time ago? No. But now we're coming to learn that it's intimate partner violence, which is aligned with cisgender women too. Of course, because we live our lives as women. So of course, we're going to have these same kind of numbers, and our intimate partners are going to be the corporates for, murdering us. So it's just about doing the work and sometimes that work is you. It's not going to be HRC. It's not going to be, the US government. They don't even want to put us on the damn census. We got to wait a whole nother 10 years if we got a fucking liberal president during that time. So, they don't even want to put us on the census. So sometimes they're not going to do it. You have to do the work. You have to do it.
Absolutely. Are there any other live questions? I have a question about how when we center the needs of Black trans people and when we center them in our work, what are the benefits for the rest of society?
The amazing Kimberly Crenshaw. We love to use these woke buzzwords like intersectionality, but there's a reason why she needed to create that theory. And that wasn't a new theory. Like she named it something else and it was new in the context of the law, but we saw it in the Combahee River Collective, they called it simultaneity. It was the same concept. It's the same exact thing. How because of our identities and the identity politics, we just have a different vantage point. We have a deeper intellectual and cultural and socio point of view that can give you a better understanding of what's going on around us. That's just what's happening. When we think about gay marriage, a lot of times when we were fighting for gay marriage, we were centering just lesbians and just gay men, but we didn't understand that Lucy Anderson Hicks was in a gay marriage rights case. Like she literally was found guilty of perjury because they said her marriage wasn't valid because she was born a boy. So is that not a gay rights case? or a marriage rights case? When we think about Christie Littleton out in Texas, she was married to her husband for 8 years. Her husband got killed in a malpractice. They invested she tried to sue them for malpractice, and the doctors hired a private investigator and found out that she was trans. And because at the time her marriage, because they found out she was trans, they invalidated her marriage, so she couldn't even sue them. She couldn't even sue them to get the money for them killing her husband. And she had been married to her husband for 8 years. That's not a gay rights case? But we weren't talking about the trans women who was making marks. Even though they were not winning, it's still they were bucking up against that system. And so we're not talking about that. And so it's important for us to know that. And then when we think about slavery, I didn't think of trans slaves. Did y'all? When I was growing up, I didn't think about trans slaves, but I learned in my research about Frances Thompson, who was living with a cisgender woman who was attacked and raped with that same cisgender woman by these white men who were mad that slavery was over. And so they ran into their house and attacked them, and she had to testify in Congress against them in 1866. I didn't know that this person existed in the world. When I think about, I found in an archive. When I think about Texas had a article that I found about this person. When they found out that Juneteenth, when they found out slavery was over, they transitioned. So what that indicates to me is that trans existed and they were slaves, but slavery was stopping them from transition, and that there was a community that would actually accept them. Because once they got out of slavery, they said, oh, I'm about to be Lizzie Montgomery.
Period.
And so that means that Black people weren't, because they were in community with Black people, weren't as conservative as we try to make it seem like, ooh, there's always Black folks. They clearly weren't as conservative during that time in the 1800s, at the late 1800s, that we try to make it seem to believe, because clearly if they felt unsafe, they wouldn't have transitioned. They literally transitioned to start living their truth. And so in my mind, those things, those nuances are important, and that's why centering us, just like we all talk about, it just gives you a whole different perspective about gender, about race, about class, about all these kind of things. Oppression, it's important to me.
Go ahead, Noelle.
It's important to center Black trans people because we teach the world about evolution. That's one of the things that I talk about in my work, is how evolution and reimagining yourself is the key to everything. If we are not reimagining ourselves, and if we are not looking at ourselves, and not just trans people, the world as well, if we are not looking at ourselves in a perspective on the opposite side of the spectrum, what are you doing? That is why it's important to center us. That is why it's important to highlight the importance of Black trans people. That's what I believe.
I'll just add really quickly that, this promised land that you say you working towards, honey, you ain't getting there without Black trans people. Right. Our liberation is meaningfully wrapped up in your liberation, right? And when we are free, you will be free too. Right. So that's why you should be centering us.
Right.
Absolutely. We are examples of radical self-love. Radical self-love. We're not just bucking up against racial systems, not just bucking up against patriarchal systems, bucking up all these motherfucking systems and saying, this is who I am. This is who I'm going to be, regardless if you fuck with it or not. This is me. I love me. This is how I'm going to be. And if you seeing us, hearing our story, hearing our experiences leads you to being free yourselves, then that is the promised land. There's some people who have lived and who grew up with a Black man as a president. There's no history in their own lived experience of a white until now. They literally grew up with an Obama. That's going to color how they look at the world. I remember when that wasn't even existent. And so that type of moral, morale, that boosts your morale as a person. If you are just out here trying to figure out if you want to tell your parents you don't want to be a doctor, you want to be an artist, if you see my experience and say, damn, if she can buck up against this whole thing, I could definitely tell my parents that I want to be a chef and not a dentist. Do you see what I'm saying? We are the examples of how we can navigate the world and be free. We are liberation. We are the liberation, embodiment of liberation of all these systems. So of course, you should center us.
Absolutely.
Period. I want to thank y'all so much for spending time and space with us. I really appreciate it. Our audience really appreciates it. I hope y'all hear and feel the love. Thank y'all so much. This event was brought to y'all by the chapters of NABJ and NLGJA here at the Berkeley J School. My name is Corey Antonio. These are our lovely guests, Diamond Stylz, Noelle, Deleon, and Tre'Vell Anderson. Do y'all have anything else to leave our lovely attendees with?
Reimagine yourselves. Look at yourself in another way. Look at your life that is not governed, that is not influenced by others. Look at your life in a way that puts you in a space of knowing. You know, that's what it's going to take to liberate yourself.
Come on, preach. You better preach. All right, y'all. I'm going to let y'all get on with the rest of y'all nights. Be safe, be loved, and come on back whenever you want.
Thank you, Corey.
Thank you, my love.
Thank you.
Y'all have a great night.